Hey everybody and welcome back to Jim's Garage. Geekom reached out to me with their IT13 2025 edition, touting it as the world's top performing, best priced i9 mini PC. Spoiler alert, it isn't. Let's get right into it. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of things I like about this. Fundamentally, I like the fact that it is so small, it is powerful, and it seems to have good build quality with metal components and minimal sort of plastic parts to it. But herein lies the big problem. That laser focus on size has crippling impacts to performance, predominantly in things like thermal throttling, which I saw and we'll check out later, but also in terms of expansion, which its competitors have better expansion with only a modest increase in size. So let's have a quick look over the specifications of the device that was sent to me, and I'll also talk about some of the upgrade paths you can have. We'll then do a breakdown of the device itself, and we'll also have a look at some of the benchmarks that I was able to run on this thing. Now, with an apparent price drop of $200 over the previous model, you would think this would be a tempting solution. It comes with an i9 13900HK, and remember, the K SKUs are ones that are unlocked, which is even more ironic as we'll get onto in the video. It has 10 cores, 16 threads, 24 megs of L3 cache, and to summarize, it's a pretty beastly CPU. It's very similar to the non-K SKU that I have in my MSO1, so I'm pretty well versed in terms of what that performance looks like, and that comparison will be more relevant as we get into the review. It comes with integrated graphics courtesy of Iris Xe, which I'm not going to dwell on too much. Suffice to say that it's competent enough for some very light gaming, light workloads, etc., but this thing is never going to be a gaming PC. And the lack of expansion, which we'll touch on later, is a key problem in that area. Now, the version I received came with 32GB of DDR4 memory, courtesy of SK Hynix. That was running at 3200 MHz, and when I asked the question, obviously, does this run DDR5 because the Intel CPU does support it, the answer was no, which is very disappointing. We can't take advantage of the faster DDR5 speeds, and we also don't get advantage of that half ECC that's on the memory die itself. The device also came with a 1TB NVMe drive, which was running at PCIe 4x4, and we'll get onto the benchmarking of that device because I don't think it's the best NVMe that it's shipped with. There is also a secondary NVMe slot in there, which when I asked the question, what is that speed? They seem to respond thinking that there's only one drive. We'll see that in the teardown. But from my testing, that one is also PCIe 4x4, so you can actually put a separate NVMe drive in here. Wi-Fi is taken care of by an Aztec media card running Wi-Fi 6E, which is a shame that it's not an Intel card, but at the same time, during my testing, it did function as expected. In terms of I/O, you do have a number of USB ports, some coming in 2, some coming in 3, and some coming in USB 4 via USB-C that also support display out, and I'll show that in more detail during the teardown. There is also an SD card reader, and for the most important part, it's a 2.5GB Intel i226-V NIC. Unfortunately, it's not a 10GB NIC in here. Lastly, this thing does come with a 3-year warranty, which you might need if you're thermal throttling all the time. So it wouldn't be right talking about this device without some direct comparison to its competitors. And now at £649 currently, it has some stiff competition from both the likes of MinisForum and Beelink. So let's have a quick check out what you can get on those competing offers and keep that in mind as we're going through this review. Now, going through that direct comparison, let's have a look at the MinisForum MSO1. This is not only just a mini PC, and you'll see a direct size comparison in the next segment of this review, it is the home labber's dream. So whilst that previous Geekom device is very handy as a small PC, you're actually getting basically the same performance in an MSO1, and you're only paying an extra £100 for an extra dual 2 10GB NICs and an extra 2.5GB NIC, and the advantage of having a PCI expansion slot, which the Geekom doesn't have. Now, if you want an actual, probably a best comparison for what I'm considering this to be, i.e. it's not a home lab PC, the Geekom, it's more of a small form factor PC that you might want to use as a home lab node, let's take a look at the Beelink, which I think is what blows this thing out of the water. So I've spec'd this up with a GTI 3 Ultra using their 13900HK, which is exactly the same. It comes with 32GB of RAM and a 1TB drive, and it also comes with the docking station. Now, there's some magic sauce there. Not only does that come in at about £550, thus it's £100 cheaper, it has a larger footprint, i.e. this machine is physically bigger and thus can dissipate the heat, so there's no thermal throttling. But that expansion dock gives it the capability to run a full-size discrete GPU. That gives you the best of both worlds. You're going to have a small form factor PC if that's all you want, or if it's all you want at that time. But if you have a heavy workload, you want to do some gaming, sure, just slap that dock on and then you've got a dedicated GPU taking full advantage of all of those specs under the hood, including DDR5. And here's an example of what that actually looks like with the dock included and the GPU plugged in. It's a pretty neat small footprint form factor where you basically have the best of both worlds, and I just can't see this Geekom competing with this. Anyway, let's head over now into the Teardown. Let's have a look what's inside this thing. So here we have the Geekom, the GT13 2025 edition, alongside the MinisForum MSA1, which is also the same size as the O1 as well. So you can see in terms of volume, I don't know the exact maths, I'd say this is about 50% the volume. So you can see it's significantly shorter, it's narrower, and it's also about the same depth, if not hair's breadth thinner. Now if we have a look at the device itself, you can see on the front that we've got two USB 3 ports, both running at 10 gigabits per second. We've got a headphone and microphone jack, and we've got the power button here. If we turn it to the side, we've got an SD card reader. Who remembers those? You'll also notice that there's a nice mesh grille here for ventilation. On the reverse is where this thing gets quite interesting. At the top we've got the exhaust for the heatsink. We've then got the barrel connector on the left, and then we've got the first of our USB 4 ports in a USB-C factor. Below that we've got a standard HDMI out. We've got a 2.5 gigabit NIC, this is an Intel i226-V. We've got a USB 3, again running at 10 gigabits. We've got a standard USB 2. We've then got another USB 4 in USB-C factor, and both of those do support display out, and we've also got another HDMI port as well at the bottom. If we turn it around to the final side, you can see again we've got another mesh, and we've also got support for a Kensington lock. You can actually remove this top panel as well. This will give you access to the CPU and its cooler. This is quite simply just a plastic shroud on top, and if I can open this, here you can see we've got access to the internal CPU heatsink and the fan. There's 4 screws in here which will allow you to basically take this out, service the fan, maybe repaste the CPU, etc. So turning this upside down, we basically have the 4 feet, and those also act as screw entry points. So I'll unscrew this now and we'll have a look inside. So once the feet are undone, and I like the feature that you can't actually pull these out, they are kind of riveted in, we should be able to just start to pull this out corner by corner, and it should just remove from the case itself. So once that's loose, you should be able to pull this. Do be careful, there is a ribbon cable, and that ribbon cable is attached to a potential SSD that you might want to put into this case. Now, most people might want to do that because it's such a small form factor and you can't put in a 3.5 inch. But other than that, we've got 2 other storage options as well, which we'll come on to. So if we start from left to right, you can see that this really is a tiny form factor. We've got some DDR4, which is a little bit disappointing because the 13900HK does support, along with all 13th gen to my knowledge, supports DDR5 memory. We can see here that we've got this NVMe drive here. This is the one that came with it, as with the RAM. This is PCIe 4 Gen 4 x 4. However, the device only seems to run at sort of PCIe 3 specs. So we'll have a look in a minute what's going on once we dive into the dashboard on Windows. And if we have a look underneath the NVMe drive, we'll see the Wi-Fi card. So if we remove the drive, hopefully we should see the Wi-Fi card. And here you can see, again, it's a MediaTek Wi-Fi card. It would have been nice to see an Intel one here. I've generally had better experiences with them in the past. But other than that, you can see access to the card reader just here. And there's also another header here, which I'm not sure what that is. I think it's actually another USB header. But other than that, really, there's nothing else going on underneath this NVMe drive. The other obvious thing to see, and you've probably noticed as looking through this device, is there is another NVMe slot here. Now, I have reached out again to ask what that is because it wasn't on the additional documentation. I'm hoping that that is another full PCIe 4x4, or even better, because 1300 does support PCIe Gen 5, I'm hoping that could be a PCIe 5x4. If that's a PCIe 5x4, I'm pretty tempted to just take this ribbon cable off, leave the top off this thing, and then get an adapter so that I can run a full-fledged PCI card on this thing. Sure, it breaks down the form factor and the benefits of that, but it does mean that I can have powerful peripherals attached to this device. So after summarizing in the introduction some of the shortfalls of being so hell-bent on such a small form factor and putting in an extremely powerful CPU, and then showing you what that looks like in terms of the physical dimensions, here we can see some actual benchmarks that bring that to life. So we've got a single core performance of 116 points, and a multi-core of 693 points. Now, the 116 is broadly in line with what you would expect for this CPU, and that's understandable because the thermal throttling is not going to come into effect with just a single core. However, that figure of 693 is significantly below what you should get. If you look at the CPU online, you'll see it well up into the 900s. And if we consult the hardware info tab over here, which I showed earlier, you can see that we reached over 100C, and yes, we were thermal throttling. So it's all fine and well trying to market this as the most powerful mini PC, but if you can't call it, there's no point in putting it in there. You might as well put a cheaper CPU in here and pass the cost savings on to the customer, whilst also giving DDR5, which your competitors are doing. Even the older 12th series, which is in one of the Beelink devices, which Brett at Raid Owl covered, you can see that his Cinebench scores are higher than this, even though this is packing a newer generation, higher SKU CPU. Again, the NVMe drive is disappointing. This is PCIe Gen 4 x4, and we're only getting 4000 megs on the sequential read and 3200 on the sequential write. Remember, those drives should be able to push towards around just over 7 gigabytes per second. So, whilst this isn't necessarily a bandwidth limitation on the device, the quality of the NVMe drive is not on par with some of the other drives out there like the Samsung 990 Pro and other similar higher tier devices. I didn't get round to testing what one of those devices would do, but I'm hopeful that if you put that into here, you would be able to get the full speed. Now, one positive thing as a result of all of this is obviously the power levels are low, especially when that thermal throttle kicks in and it starts to underclock the CPU. But that's hardly a positive. So how do I summarize this device? It's quite simple. I don't recommend it. I like the build quality, I like what they've tried to do, but they've bitten off more than they can chew with trying to put such a beefy CPU into such a small package. It would have been better off going for a smaller CPU, something lower down in the 13th gen SKU, and passing those savings on to the consumer. And whilst you're at it, why not stick some DDR5 in there when all of your competitors are doing it? You either need to bump this up slightly and get a better cooling solution, or bump it down and pass on those cost savings. Also, while you're at it, I don't see why you can't throw in something like an Oculink adapter. That would be quite simple to do, and it would enable you to expand this device should you wish. So I hope Geekom can kind of take this on board and maybe produce something a little bit more in line with expectations and try not to cheat physics. In the meantime as well, it would be great to see one of the competitors to the Beelink come out in a similar sort of form factor. I really like the idea of having something that is still portable, but if I want to, I can expand it and put some real horsepower into it. Anyway, thanks for watching everybody. If you've liked this video, give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care everybody.